Somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, 3 wooden ships creak and groan in the darkness. The smell hits you first. 33 days of unwashed bodies, spaces barely longer than a tennis court, spoiling food stores, bilge water sloshing beneath the decks, salt spray coats everything. Your clothes, your hair, the ropes you grip to steady yourself as the deck tilts beneath your feet. The night air is warm and thick, but the spray is cold against your skin. It is October 11th, 1492. You are standing on the Santa María, and the man who brought you here has been lying to you for weeks. 90 exhausted men, 3 ships, and a captain who keeps 2 sets of logs, one recording the real distance travelled, one showing his crew a number that's always a little smaller, a little less terrifying, because the truth would have caused a mutiny weeks ago. These men signed up for a shortcut to Asia. They did not sign up to sail into nothing. But tonight, the signs are everywhere. Flocks of birds banking southwest, fresh vegetation floating past the hull, the colour of the water shifting from deep Atlantic blue to something greener, something shallower. Everyone can feel it. Something is close. Nobody on these ships knows what is about to happen. In a few hours, a lookout named Rodrigo de Triana will spot white cliffs gleaming in the moonlight, and he will shout a single word that divides human history into before and after. Land. What we've been taught about October 12th, 1492, is mostly mythology. Not slightly wrong, not oversimplified, almost completely wrong. The heroic explorer, the grateful natives, the dawn of civilization in the New World, that story was carefully constructed. First by the man who told it, then by 5 centuries of people who found it more comfortable than the truth. Tonight, we're going to tell you what actually happened, because what actually happened is stranger, more human, more devastating, and more relevant to your life right now than any textbook version has ever been. And if you're using this to fall asleep tonight, that's exactly what this is for. Maybe hit subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments where you are right now and what time it is. I always check. Singapore at sunrise, Seattle at midnight, Sao Paulo at dawn. Someone in Iceland at 3 in the morning because the sun won't cooperate. All of us listening to the same story about a night that changed everything. Tonight, we're going back to 1492. But not the version you learned in school. We're going to stand on that beach when Columbus first steps ashore, the smell of tropical air, the confusion of 2 civilizations staring at each other across an impossible distance. We're going to meet the Taíno, a people with a civilization so sophisticated that Columbus looked at them and saw everything except what was actually there. We'll follow him as he wanders the Caribbean, convinced he's found Asia, watching his first colony vanish without a trace, and launching the greatest biological collision in human history. A collision between 2 hemispheres that had evolved independently for over 10,000 years. The aftershocks of that collision are still in your kitchen cupboard tonight, and we'll follow Columbus all the way to his final breath. And what he still believed even then will change how you see everything about this story. The night of October 11th, 1492 was the last night the world was truly separate. By morning, it never would be again. So settle in, get comfortable. We're about to sail into the most consequential dawn in human history, launched by a man whose calculations were off by a factor of 4. And here's something to think about as you drift. Every tomato you've ever eaten, every flu season you've ever endured, every word of English spoken anywhere in the Americas tonight, all of it traces back to what happens on that beach in a few hours, and to the certainty of the man standing on that deck. This story isn't rushed. History never is, and neither are we. So let it carry you wherever you need to go tonight. But first, we need to understand the world Columbus left behind, because this voyage didn't come from nowhere. It came from a Europe that was broken, frightened, and looking for a way out. Picture Europe in the late 15th century. Start with the smell. Depending on which city you're standing in, it's some combination of wood smoke, animal waste, open drainage, and the faint sweetness of age that nobody quite notices anymore. Because it's been there for generations. The streets are narrow, the buildings lean into each other like tired old friends, and the people, The people are fewer than they used to be, far fewer. A century and a half earlier, something had swept through this continent that still defied full explanation: the Great Illness. It moved through cities like a whisper, and when it was finished, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's entire population was gone. Think about that for a moment. Imagine looking around your neighbourhood and realising that every other house is empty. Not temporarily empty, permanently empty. The people who lived there are never coming back. By the 1480s, Europe was still recovering. Entire villages had been abandoned, labour was scarce, treasuries were depleted, and the kingdoms that had survived were hungry. Hungry for something that could restore their power and refill their vaults. Here's the thing about 15th century Europe. It was addicted to something it couldn't produce: spices. Not the little jar of cinnamon sitting in your kitchen. The kind of spices that, in this era, were worth more than their weight in gold. Pepper, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon. These weren't luxuries. They were necessities. For preserving food, for medicine, for masking the taste of meat that had been sitting around for rather longer than you'd want to think about. And all of them came from one direction: east, from the islands of Southeast Asia, through overland routes and sea lanes, controlled entirely by Venice, Genoa, and the Ottoman Empire. A handful of pepper that might cost a few coins at its origin, it could sell for 30 or 40 times that price by the time it reached a kitchen in London or Lisbon. Whoever found a new route to those spice islands would change the balance of power in Europe overnight. A route that bypassed Venice, bypassed the Ottomans, bypassed every middleman who had been getting rich for centuries. Portugal had been trying for decades. Their sailors had been creeping down the coast of Africa, mile by cautious mile, looking for a way around the bottom of the continent and east toward India. It was slow, dangerous work. Ships went out and didn't come back. But the Portuguese were methodical, patient, and they were getting closer. Spain, meanwhile, had been busy with something else entirely. On January 2nd, 1492, just 9 months before Columbus would spot land in the Caribbean, the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, rode into Granada, the last stronghold of Islamic rule on the Iberian Peninsula. The Reconquista, a campaign that had lasted nearly 800 years, was finally over. Spain was unified, Catholic, triumphant, and flat broke. 8 centuries of conflict will do that to a treasury. The celebrations in Granada had barely ended when Ferdinand and Isabella signed the Alhambra Decree, ordering the expulsion of roughly 200,000 Jewish residents who refused to convert to Christianity. 200,000 people, many of them among the most educated and economically productive citizens in Spain, given 4 months to leave or face the consequences. It was into this world that a man from Genoa walked into the Spanish court, a world of depleted treasuries, religious zealotry, and an almost desperate hunger for new sources of wealth. He came with an idea that most educated people thought was insane. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. What matters right now is this. The voyage of 1492 was not born from heroic vision. It was born from economic desperation, religious fervour, and the simple, brutal mathematics of the spice trade. Europe didn't sail west because it was curious about what lay beyond the horizon. Europe sailed west because it was running out of options. And the man who convinced Spain to bet on his plan? The man standing on the deck of the Santa Maria, keeping 2 sets of logs, sailing into a darkness that even he didn't fully understand. He was not a hero. He was not a villain. He was something far more complicated and far more human than either of those stories. He was a man who believed something so completely that he would carry that belief unchanged and unshaken all the way to his grave. His name was Cristoforo Colombo, and to understand what happened next, you need to understand the man. His name was Cristoforo Colombo, born around 1451 inches, the Republic of Genoa, son of a wool weaver named Domenico. And if you're picturing some noble family producing a destined explorer, stop right there. This was a working-class household. The smell of raw wool and dye, a father who spent his days at the loom, a boy who grew up watching ships come and go from one of the busiest ports in the Mediterranean. At some point, he decided the sea was more interesting than sheep. He went to sea young. By his 20s, Columbus was sailing commercial routes across the Mediterranean and down the coast of West Africa on Portuguese trading vessels. He wasn't formally educated, no university, no noble patronage, no connections, but he read, obsessively. He got his hands on every map, every navigational text, every account of distant lands he could find. Marco Polo's travels, Ptolemy's geography, Pierre Dailly's Imago Mundi. He filled the margins with notes, hundreds of notes, some brilliant, some completely wrong. And here's what nobody tells you about Columbus's grand idea. It wasn't new. The concept of sailing west to reach Asia had been discussed by educated Europeans for decades. Everyone who understood geography knew the Earth was round. That myth about Columbus, proving the Earth wasn't flat, is itself a myth. The question was never shape. The question was size. And this is where Columbus made the mistake that would change the world. He calculated the distance from the Canary Islands to Japan at roughly 3,000 miles. The actual distance is closer to 12,000. He was off by a factor of 4, not a small rounding error, not an optimistic estimate, a catastrophic miscalculation. Had the Americas not existed, everyone aboard those 3 ships would have perished somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. But here's the thing, and this is crucial to understanding everything that follows. Columbus didn't make this error carelessly. He made it deliberately. He cherry-picked the sources that supported the smallest possible Earth. He ignored the ones that didn't, and he arrived at a number that conveniently made his voyage look feasible. Was it self-deception? Confirmation bias? Outright fraud? Historians have been arguing about this for 5 centuries, and the honest answer is probably all 3, in varying proportions at different times. What we do know is that he believed it, completely, unshakably, and he would go on believing it for the rest of his life. He pitched the idea to the Portuguese court first. King John II's advisors reviewed Columbus's calculations, compared them against their own far more accurate estimates, and politely told him he was wrong. The distance was too great. The ships would never make it. Columbus left Portugal. He tried England, rejected. He tried France, rejected. For nearly a decade, Columbus wandered from court to court, carrying his maps and his certainty, looking for someone who would listen. And finally, Spain listened. Not because Ferdinand and Isabella believed his geography. Their own advisors told them the same thing the Portuguese had said: the math didn't work. But Spain had just finished an 800-year war. The treasury was empty. Portugal was pulling ahead in the race for eastern sea routes. And here was a man offering them a shortcut, asking for relatively little in return. The deal they struck tells you everything. Columbus would receive 10% of all revenues from any lands he discovered, the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, and governorship of whatever territories he claimed. In exchange, he needed ships and crew. The total cost came to roughly 1.4 million maravedis. And here's where it gets interesting. The Crown didn't even fund most of it. Private investors, particularly the Santangle and Pinzon families, fronted the majority of the cash. This wasn't a royal expedition. It was closer to a venture capital deal with royal backing, a speculative bet on a man whose business plan had been rejected by every serious investor in Europe. 3 ships, 90 men, and a captain whose entire theory of where he was going was built on a mathematical error. An error he had convinced himself was truth. If the Americas hadn't existed, there would be no story to tell. Columbus and his crew would have sailed into the open Pacific and simply vanished. The ocean would have swallowed them the way it had swallowed countless ships before. But the Americas did exist. And that accident, the collision between one man's delusion and an entire continent's reality, is the hinge on which the modern world turns. On August 3rd, 1492, 3 ships slipped out of the port of Palos de la Frontera and turned west into the Atlantic. And for 33 days nothing happened except the slow, grinding terror of sailing into the unknown. On August 3rd, 1492, 3 ships slipped out of the port of Palos de la Frontera before dawn: the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, each one barely longer than a tennis court. 90 men between them, plus livestock, provisions, trade goods, and enough water for what Columbus had promised would be a journey of roughly 4 weeks. The first stop was the Canary Islands, a week to take on fresh water and make repairs. Then, on September 6th, they turned their bows west and left behind the last land any of them had ever seen. Picture the Atlantic in early September. The trade winds are steady. The water is a blue so deep it looks almost black. You are standing on a wooden deck that never stops moving, a gentle rolling during calm seas, a nauseating pitch and yaw when the weather turns. The air smells of tar, salt, damp wood, and the slowly ripening odour of men who have nowhere to bathe. Below decks, the bilge water sloshes with every wave, mixing with spilled provisions and the waste of animals kept in makeshift pens. And every single day, the sun rises behind you and sets ahead of you, and the horizon is exactly the same empty line it was yesterday. Columbus kept 2 logs. The public one, shown to his officers, recorded shorter daily distances, making the fleet appear closer to home than it actually was. The private one recorded the real numbers. This was calculated deception. He knew that if his men understood how far they had truly sailed from everything they knew, the fear would become unmanageable. Here's what makes those dual logs so revealing. Columbus wasn't just managing his crew's anxiety, he was managing reality itself. 2 versions of the same journey, running in parallel. One for the people who needed comfort, one for the man who needed to know the truth. It was the same skill he would deploy for the rest of his life, in courts and colonies and desperate letters to the Spanish crown. The ability to maintain 2 stories simultaneously and believe, somehow, that both were true. The first 3 weeks passed without crisis. The trade winds pushed them steadily west. Flying fish leapt alongside the hulls. The weather was warm. Columbus noted with satisfaction that his men seemed calm. Then they hit the Sargasso Sea. Imagine sailing into a stretch of ocean where the water is suddenly thick with floating vegetation, mats of golden brown seaweed stretching to the horizon in every direction. The rudders tangled, the hulls dragged. Sailors who had never seen anything like it began whispering. They had sailed into the edge of the world. The sea itself was turning solid. They would be trapped here until the water and food ran out. Columbus pushed through, the seaweed thinned, the open ocean returned, but the damage was psychological. By late September, the crew's unease had hardened into something more dangerous. They had been at sea for over 3 weeks with no sign of land. The wind blew relentlessly from the east, and that meant one thing to every sailor aboard. If the wind only blows one direction out here, how do we get back? Columbus didn't have a good answer for that. By early October, the whispers had turned into open confrontation. Men gathered in small groups on deck, speaking in low voices that went silent when Columbus approached. The officers reported growing unrest. The Pinzon brothers, who captained the Nina and the Pinta, were losing patience. October 10th, a deadline emerged. Spoken or unspoken, the consensus was forming. 3 more days. If they didn't find land in 3 more days, they would turn back, whether Columbus agreed or not. But here's where the ocean itself intervened. October 11th. The signs multiplied, a branch with berries floating past the hull, a carved stick carved, not broken, flocks of birds banking consistently to the southwest. The colour of the water shifting from deep Atlantic blue to something greener, warmer, shallower. A reed, a piece of cane, something that looked like it might have been a flower. The energy on the ships changed. Men who had been planning confrontation were now standing at the rails, staring at the horizon, waiting. That night, the night of October 11th, 1492 Columbus ordered the fleet to maintain full sail through the darkness. Every man was on deck, every eye was forward. The moon was up, casting a pale light across the water, and at approximately 2 in the morning on October 12th, a lookout named Rodrigo de Triana stood in the crow's nest of the Pinta. He saw something white gleaming in the moonlight ahead. He opened his mouth and shouted the word that every man aboard had been dreaming about for 33 days. Land. The sound carried across the water from ship to ship. Men who had been gripping ropes in the darkness suddenly found themselves gripping each other. Some knelt, some wept, some simply stood very still, staring at that pale line on the horizon, trying to understand that the impossible thing had actually happened. Nobody on those ships had any idea what they were looking at. They thought it was the outer islands of Asia, an archipelago near Japan, perhaps. The beginning of the spice-rich East that Europe had been dreaming about for centuries. They were wrong about everything. And the man who had brought them here, the man who had kept 2 sets of logs and cherry-picked his geography, had convinced a bankrupt kingdom to bet on his certainty. He would go on being wrong about this for the rest of his life. But that's a story for later tonight. At dawn, Columbus, dressed in his finest clothes, unfurled the royal banner of Castile and climbed into a small boat. He was about to set foot on a beach that would divide human history into before and after. Imagine being on that beach at dawn. The sand is white. The water behind you is a turquoise so vivid it almost doesn't look real, like someone painted it. The air is warm and heavy with moisture, carrying the scent of flowers you've never encountered before, mixed with the salt of the Caribbean and something green, something alive, something that smells nothing like any coast in Europe. Palm trees rise along the shore. The sound of birds, strange birds, birds that make sounds you've never heard, fills the canopy above. And walking toward you, across this beach, is a group of people. They are watching with what Columbus would later describe as curiosity, not fear. They are wearing very little. Their skin is painted. Some wear small gold ornaments in their ears and noses. They are healthy, well-fed, and clearly at home in a way that the stumbling, seasick, salt-crusted Europeans very obviously are not. These are the Taíno people of the island they call Guanahani. Columbus calls it San Salvador. He plants a flag, he unfurls the royal banner, and then he does something that, 500 years later, still has the power to take your breath away with its absurdity. He reads a legal proclamation, in Spanish, to an audience that does not speak Spanish, declaring that this island, and everything on it, now belongs to Ferdinand and Isabella of Castile. By the grace of God and the authority of the Pope, the Taíno stand there, watching this strange ceremony. Picture the same polite confusion you might feel if someone walked into your living room, unrolled a scroll, and announced in a language you'd never heard that your house now belonged to them. Here's the thing about that first morning. The first act of European colonization in the Americas was a legal fiction, a performance of sovereignty over people who had no idea what sovereignty meant, conducted in a language they couldn't understand, backed by an authority they'd never heard of. It was theatre, and the audience didn't know they were watching a play. Columbus's journal entries from this day are some of the most studied sentences in history, and they reveal everything about what was really happening inside his mind. He noted that the Taíno were generous and willing to trade. Good. He noted that they wore small amounts of gold. Very good. He noted that they seemed to have no weapons. They appeared unfamiliar with swords. When he showed one to a Taíno man, the man grabbed the blade and cut himself. He'd never seen one before. And then Columbus wrote the sentence that echoes across 5 centuries, that these people were so accommodating, so trusting, that they could probably be brought under control, with just 50 men. Not befriended, not traded with, brought under control. This was the first day, before any conflict, before any misunderstanding, before any of the things that would follow. On the very first morning, looking at people who had welcomed him with open hands, Columbus was already calculating how easily they could be dominated. The trade began immediately. Glass beads for gold ornaments, hawks' bells, tiny brass bells meant for falconry, were treated by the Taíno as treasures. Columbus noted with satisfaction that 16 balls of cotton could be obtained for a handful of glass beads. The exchange rate, from a European perspective, was spectacularly favourable. From a Taíno perspective, of course, the equation looked very different. They were trading common materials for exotic novelties from across an ocean. In their framework, the exchange made perfect sense. But here's where it gets troubling. Columbus wasn't conducting trade, he was conducting reconnaissance. Every observation in his journal was filtered through 2 questions. Where is the gold, and how easily can these people be controlled? The Taíno, meanwhile, had their own framework for understanding strangers. Their culture had protocols for hospitality, for gift-giving, for welcoming visitors. They were applying those protocols with grace and generosity to a group of men who were interpreting every act of kindness as evidence of exploitability. 2 civilizations, Two completely different operating systems, looking at each other across a beach on a Caribbean morning, each one seeing something entirely different. The Taíno saw visitors, Columbus saw assets. And now think about this, because it's the kind of thought experiment that can keep you up at night, or maybe, tonight, let you drift into it. Imagine the reverse. Imagine if a Taíno canoe had somehow crossed the Atlantic and landed in Spain. A Taíno cacique steps ashore in Seville. He plants a wooden staff in the ground, and he announces in Arawak, a language no one in Spain has ever heard, that the city of Seville now belongs to the cacique of Guanahani, by the authority of the Zemis and the great spirit Yucahu. The Spanish would have thought he was insane, but that is exactly what Columbus did, and it worked, not because it was legitimate, but because behind the ceremony stood ships, behind the ships stood cannons, and behind the cannons stood an entire civilization, one that had spent 800 years perfecting the machinery of territorial expansion. The Taíno watching from the tree line that morning had no way of knowing any of this. They saw curious strangers. They offered food and water. They pointed toward the places where gold could be found. They had no idea they had just been claimed. Over the next few weeks, Columbus would take 6 Taíno captives as guides and begin sailing from island to island, looking for something that existed only in his imagination. Before we follow Columbus further into the Caribbean, we need to stop, because the story of 1492 isn't just about the men who arrived. It's about the people who were already there. And the people who were already there had built something remarkable. The Taíno civilization, at the time Columbus stumbled into their world, spread across most of the Caribbean, from the Bahamas to Hispaniola, Puerto Rico to Jamaica and beyond. Population estimates vary, but most historians place the number somewhere between 1 and 3 million people, spread across hundreds of communities on dozens of islands. They were master seafarers. Their canoes carved from single tree trunks could hold 50 or more people, and were capable of open ocean voyages between islands separated by miles of deep water. They navigated by stars, by currents, by the behavior of birds. They had been doing this for centuries before Columbus arrived, with his miscalculated maps and his certainty that he knew where he was. Here's what nobody tells you about the Taíno. They weren't simple. The word Columbus used and generations of European historians repeated was some variation of primitive or naive. But consider what they had actually built. Their agricultural system was extraordinary. They practiced conuco farming, mounding soil into raised beds that improved drainage, prevented erosion, and allowed multiple crops to grow simultaneously. It was, in everything but name, a form of permaculture that modern agronomists are only now beginning to fully appreciate. And then there was cassava. Cassava, also called manioc, was their staple crop. And here's what makes their cassava processing remarkable. The variety they cultivated, bitter cassava, is naturally laced with cyanide compounds. Eaten raw, it can be lethal. The Taíno had developed a multi-step process to extract the poison, grating, pressing, washing, and fermenting the root into a safe, nutritious flour. This wasn't simple cooking. This was biochemical engineering, developed over generations of trial and observation, encoded in cultural knowledge and passed from hand to hand across centuries. Columbus watched them do this. He noted it in his journal, and he moved on, looking for gold. Their society had structure. Caciques, chiefs, who could be either men or women, governed communities through a combination of hereditary authority and demonstrated competence. Yes, women could become caciques. In a Europe where queens were rare exceptions and female political power was viewed with deep suspicion, Taíno women could hold the highest position of leadership in their communities. As a matter of ordinary practice, they had a rich spiritual life built around zemis, carved figures and stones that represented ancestral spirits and natural forces. They had elaborate cosmology, complex social hierarchies, and inter-island trade networks that connected communities across hundreds of miles of open water. They had art, they had music, they had games, a ball game called Beatty that was played on stone-lined courts and held deep ceremonial significance. And they had something else, something harder to quantify but essential to understanding who they were. They fell in love, they grieved losses, they worried about their children, They took pride in their craftsmanship and argued about politics. They told jokes and sang songs, and they sat up late at night talking about things that mattered to them. They were, in every way that counts, as fully and completely human as anyone listening to this right now. They understood something we're still learning, that humans aren't meant to navigate the dark alone. Their communities were built around gathering, around sharing, around the simple, ancient practice of being together when the night is long. Columbus looked at all of this: the agriculture, the seafaring, the social structure, the art, the humanity. And what he wrote in his journal was that they would make excellent servants. He saw everything, and he understood nothing, because he wasn't looking at people. He was looking through the lens of a delusion that had already decided what the world was supposed to be. And in that delusion, these people were not a civilization. They were a resource. They were not waiting for someone to discover them. They had already discovered themselves long ago and built a world that worked. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because Columbus wasn't staying on one island. He was already moving, sailing from island to island with Taíno captives as reluctant guides, chasing rumors of gold and the growing certainty that the Asian mainland was just over the next horizon. Columbus took 6 Taíno captives. He doesn't use that word in his journal, he calls them guides. But they didn't volunteer. They were taken from their homes on Guanahani, placed on European ships they had never seen before, sailing toward islands they may or may not have wanted to visit, serving a man whose intentions they were only beginning to understand. With his reluctant guides pointing the way, Columbus began island hopping through the Bahamas, then south and west toward the larger islands. He was looking for 2 things: gold and Asia. The gold he found in traces, small ornaments, flakes in riverbeds, enough to keep the dream alive but never enough to fill a ship. The Taíno, when asked about gold through an improvised sign language that both sides thought they understood but almost certainly didn't, consistently pointed further south. More gold there, always further. Whether they were telling the truth, telling Columbus what he wanted to hear, or simply trying to get him to leave their particular island and become someone else's problem, we'll never know. Asia he found everywhere. On October 28th, Columbus reached the northern coast of Cuba, a massive island with mountains, rivers, and a lush interior. He was immediately certain he had reached the Chinese mainland, the province of Cathay perhaps, or Mangi. He sent 2 men ashore with letters addressed to the Great Khan of China, along with gifts appropriate for an Asian emperor. The scouts walked inland for several days. They found no emperor, no silk-roofed palaces, no spice markets. What they did find was a village of about 50 houses, a population that was friendly and confused by the letters they were being shown, and something they had never seen before: people rolling dried leaves into tubes, setting one end on fire, and inhaling the smoke. They had just encountered tobacco. The scouts brought some back to the ships, noted it with mild curiosity in their reports, and moved on. Nobody on those ships had any idea what they were looking at: a plant that would eventually reshape global economics, reshape public health, and remain one of the leading causes of preventable illness on Earth 500 years later. But Columbus wasn't interested in tobacco. He was interested in the Khan. Here's the thing about Columbus's delusion. It wasn't just optimism. It was architectural. He didn't simply hope he had reached Asia, he actively constructed an Asia out of whatever he could see. When the Taíno pointed toward the interior of Cuba and used a word that sounded vaguely like Cubanacan, meaning the middle of Cuba, Columbus heard El Gran Khan, the Great Khan. He wrote it down. He believed it. He sailed on. This pattern repeated itself across weeks and hundreds of miles of Caribbean coastline. Every piece of information was filtered through the same delusion. Rivers became the approaches to Chinese ports. Villages became the outskirts of Asian cities. Gold ornaments became proof that the mines of Sipangu were nearby. He was describing 2 places simultaneously. The place that actually existed, a Caribbean archipelago populated by millions of people, with their own civilizations, their own histories, their own names for everything. And the place he needed to exist, Asia, the destination that would justify his calculations, validate his certainty, and deliver the riches he had promised a bankrupt Spanish crown. By December 6th, Columbus reached the island the Taíno called Haiti. He renamed it La Isla Española Hispaniola, and here, for the first time, the gold was more than flakes and ornaments. The Taíno on Hispaniola wore more gold than any he had seen. They spoke of mines in the interior. Columbus's journal entries from Hispaniola shift in tone. The wonder is still there, the beauty of the landscape, the warmth of the air, the generosity of the people. But underneath it, rising like a tide, is something harder. Calculation, acquisition, control. But here's where it gets troubling. Reading the journal from these weeks is like watching someone slowly lose the ability to see the world as it actually is. Every day, the gap between Columbus's internal narrative and external reality grew wider. He was running a fantasy and a colonial enterprise simultaneously, and the fantasy was winning. Remember those invisible biological forces we mentioned at the beginning? The ones that would shape the modern world more than any sword or proclamation? We're not there yet. But every day Columbus spent on these islands, every handshake, every shared meal, every breath exchange between European lungs and Caribbean air, the clock was ticking on something nobody could see, something that would make everything else look small. And then, on Christmas Eve, 1492, something happened that would turn a voyage of discovery into the birth of an empire and the beginning of a vanishing. Picture the Caribbean night. The water is so still it looks like black glass. Somewhere in the darkness, tree frogs are singing, a high rhythmic pulse, almost like tiny bells. The air is warm and heavy, the scent of flowers you have never smelled before, mixed with salt. And something green, something ancient. Stars reflect on the water so perfectly that it is hard to tell where the sky ends and the ocean begins. Distant surf breaks gently against a reef you cannot see. The ships creak at anchor, rocking so softly it feels almost like breathing. This is the Caribbean on the night before everything changes. It is December 24th, 1492, Christmas Eve. Columbus has been sailing along the northern coast of Hispaniola for nearly 3 weeks now. The signs have been encouraging. More gold here than anywhere else he has visited. The Taíno communities are larger, more organized, and their cacique, a leader named Guacanagari, has been generous and welcoming. Columbus is exhausted, but convinced he is close to something significant. Here's what happened on Christmas Eve, 1492. The fleet, now reduced to 2 ships after the Pinta had separated weeks earlier, was sailing along the coast at night. The winds were light, the sea was calm, and Columbus, who had been awake for nearly 2 days managing the navigation, finally went below to sleep. He left instructions for the helmsman to maintain course. The helmsman, equally exhausted, passed the tiller to a cabin boy. A child, essentially, steering a ship through unfamiliar waters on a dark Caribbean night, because every adult aboard was too tired to stand. The cabin boy held the tiller, the ship drifted, and sometime after midnight a slow grinding sound rose from beneath the hull. The Santa María had run aground on a coral reef, not a dramatic collision, not a storm-driven catastrophe. A slow, quiet grounding. The kind of disaster that happens when everyone is too exhausted to pay attention. The ship settled onto the coral. With each gentle wave, the reef carved deeper into the wooden hull. Water began seeping in through the planks. Columbus rushed on deck. He ordered the crew to cut the mast, throw cargo overboard to lighten the ship, but the tide was falling. With each passing minute, the Santa María settled deeper onto the reef. By morning, it was clear. The flagship was lost. Now, here's what makes La Navidad so significant. Columbus stood on the beach of a Caribbean island on Christmas morning, watching his largest ship slowly break apart on a coral reef. And he made a decision that would echo across centuries. He would build something from the wreckage. With timber salvaged from the Santa María, Columbus ordered the construction of a fort. He named it La Navidad, the Nativity, because it was born on Christmas Day, the first European structure in the Americas, built from the remains of a shipwreck on an island that Columbus still believed was somewhere near the coast of Asia. The Taíno helped. Guacanagari sent his people to assist with salvaging cargo and building the fort. They brought food. They offered shelter. They watched these strange men pulling apart their broken ship and hammering the pieces into walls, and they helped, because that is what their culture taught them to do with strangers in need. Columbus selected 39 men to stay behind. He gave them provisions, trade goods, and instructions that read like a document written by someone who had already stopped listening to reality. Keep peace with the Taíno, explore the interior, find the gold mines, wait for his return. 39 men, on an island they did not understand, surrounded by a civilization they had already begun to underestimate, with instructions that assumed the world would cooperate with European plans. Those instructions would not survive the months ahead. Columbus sailed away on the Niña on January 4th, 1493, leaving La Navidad behind him, a tiny wooden fort on a Caribbean beach, held by men who were already, in some fundamental way, alone. What happened next? What happened to those 39 men on that beach is one of the oldest mysteries of the colonial era, and the answer, when Columbus found it, changed everything about what came after. Columbus returned to Hispaniola on his second voyage, nearly a year later, November 1493. He came back with 17 ships this time, over 1,000 men, horses, cattle, seeds, and the full apparatus of colonization. He came back expecting to find La Navidad thriving, 39 men with a year's head start on building a European outpost in paradise. What he found was silence. The fort was gone. Not abandoned, destroyed, charred timbers, scattered belongings. The structures that had been built from the wreckage of the Santa María were themselves now wreckage. The gardens Columbus had ordered planted were overgrown and wild. None of the 39 men remained. But here's what really happened to those 39 men. Or rather, here's what we think happened, pieced together from fragments of testimony and centuries of archaeological investigation. The men ignored Columbus's instructions almost immediately. Within weeks of his departure, they had split into factions. Some went inland, demanding food and gold from Taíno communities that had been generous when asked but had never agreed to be commanded. Others took Taíno women, others simply drifted, rudderless without leadership. In a place they had no framework for understanding, the Taíno patience, which Columbus had mistaken for submission, had limits. Tensions escalated. The details are disputed. Spanish accounts blame Taíno aggression. The archaeological evidence suggests something more complicated. A story of provocation, resistance, and mutual misunderstanding. What we do know is that at some point the relationship broke down completely. Guacanagari, the cacique who had helped build La Navidad in the first place, later told Columbus that a rival cacique named Caonabo had led the attack. But Guacanagari himself was injured. Some historians interpreted this as evidence that he tried to defend the Europeans, others that the situation had spiraled beyond anyone's control. The truth is probably somewhere in that uncomfortable middle ground, where most historical truths live. We cannot reconstruct the final days of La Navidad with certainty. We do not know if the end came in a single night, or over weeks of deteriorating relations. We do not know the names of most of the 39 men, or what they thought about in those last days, or whether any of them understood that they had brought this upon themselves. Here's the thing about La Navidad's failure. It wasn't a tragedy that happened to Europeans. It was a tragedy that Europeans created. 39 men were left in a place they did not respect, among people they did not understand, with instructions built on the assumption that European authority was self-evident. When that assumption met reality, when the Taíno stopped being hospitable and started being human, the men of La Navidad had no framework for what came next. La Navidad was supposed to be a birth, a beginning, the nativity named for the holy night that gave it life. In a sense, it was a beginning. Its failure taught Columbus and the Spanish crown something important. Colonization could not be accomplished by simply planting a flag and assuming cooperation. It would require something more systematic, something more deliberate, something with the weight of law and the backing of force. That lesson would shape everything that followed. Modern archaeologists continue to search for La Navidad's exact location, near the modern town of Caracol on Haiti's northern coast. They have found European artifacts, buckles, nails, fragments of pottery. But the fort itself remains elusive, buried under centuries of Caribbean soil, and the slow, patient work of a landscape that doesn't remember European ambitions. Somewhere right now, Someone else is listening to this same story, in a different time zone, unable to sleep for their own reasons. We're all here together, thinking about 39 men on a beach 500 years ago, wondering what we would have done differently. And maybe that's the point, that the distance between us and them is smaller than we'd like to believe. The island doesn't remember the fort, the reef doesn't remember the Santa Maria, but the consequences of what happened here, the lesson that La Navidad taught the men who came after those consequences, are still unfolding. Columbus stood in the ruins for a long time, and then he did what he always did. He wrote a story about what had happened, a story that cast himself as the victim and the Taíno as the villains, and he sailed for home to tell it. Stand here for a moment in the quiet. The fort is gone, the men are gone. There is just warm breeze moving through the charred remains, carrying the scent of turned earth, and tropical flowers growing through the wreckage. The Caribbean doesn't care about European ambitions. It simply continues. The reef still breaking, the birds still calling, the water still that impossible shade of blue-green that Columbus described in his journal as the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The island has already begun to reclaim La Navidad. Within a few seasons, the jungle will cover what's left. Within a few decades, nobody walking this beach will know that anything was ever built here. Columbus sailed from Hispaniola on January 4th, 1493, aboard the Niña, the smallest of the original 3 ships. The Pinta, which had separated under Martín Alonso Pinzón weeks earlier, rejoined the fleet briefly before the crossing. The return voyage was nothing like the outward journey. The trade winds that had carried them west so smoothly now worked against them. Columbus charted a course northeast, into the open Atlantic, searching for the westerly winds that would carry them back to Europe. In February, they found those winds. They also found something else. Storms. The kind of Atlantic storms that make experienced sailors question every decision they have ever made. The Niña was tossed through waves that Columbus described as mountains of water. The ships separated in the darkness. For days, each crew believed the other had sunk. Columbus, alone on the Niña in the middle of the Atlantic, did something remarkable. He wrote 2 accounts of his discoveries, sealed them in waterproof casks, and threw them into the ocean. One addressed to the Spanish monarchs, one to whoever might find it. These were not messages designed for rescue. They were messages designed for legacy. Even in the grip of a storm that might end his life, Columbus was thinking about the story, not the survival, the narrative, the version of events that would reach the world even if he didn't. Here's where Columbus became something more dangerous than an explorer. He became a storyteller. He survived. Both ships survived, arriving separately in Portugal and then Spain in March 1493. And the story Columbus told in his letter, in his audiences with the court, in the performance he staged in Barcelona, was a masterpiece of selective truth. The letter went viral. There is no other word for it. Within months it had been translated into Latin, Italian, and German. Copies were circulating across Europe. It described a paradise of gentle people, abundant gold, spice-rich islands ripe for harvest. It mentioned the Taíno, but only as evidence of how easy colonization would be. It mentioned the shipwreck, but framed it as divine providence, not navigational failure. It did not mention the dual logs, the near mutiny, or the growing evidence that Columbus had not, in fact, reached Asia. The reception in Barcelona was theatre on a grand scale. Columbus paraded through the streets with parrots, exotic textiles, gold ornaments, and most significantly several kidnapped Taíno, dressed in European clothes, presented to the court as living trophies from the edge of the known world. Picture that scene for a moment. Men and women taken from their homes across an ocean, standing in a European court, surrounded by people staring at them, with a mixture of wonder and calculation, their ears no longer hearing the soft surf of Caribbean beaches, their world reduced to a spectacle. The cruelty was invisible. The crowd in Barcelona saw wonder, not abduction. They saw proof of a new world, not the beginning of the end for an old one. They saw a hero returning with gifts, not a man who had left 39 of his own people to a fate he was already rewriting in his official account. And the Spanish crown saw something else entirely. They saw an opportunity. The letter described gold. It described land. It described people who could be, and the word Columbus chose was deliberately ambiguous, brought into the service of the faith. Within 6 months of Columbus's return, Ferdinand and Isabella were planning the second voyage. Not 3 ships this time, 17, not 90 men, over 1,000. Not exploration, colonization. The story Columbus told in Barcelona was the match. Everything that followed was the fire. But while Columbus was telling his story in Barcelona, something was happening in Rome that would make his claims look modest by comparison. Because the Pope was about to do something that still defies belief. He was going to divide the entire world in half. In a quiet room in Rome, a man who has never seen the ocean is about to divide it. The room smells of parchment and candle wax. Outside, church bells mark the hour. With the steady, unhurried rhythm that has been marking hours in this city for over 1,000 years, dust motes drift through slanted light. A pen hovers over a document that will reshape the geography of human civilization. The weight of what is about to happen sits in the silence between pen strokes. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, a man whose relationship with power was, to put it diplomatically, complicated, issued a series of papal bulls in 1493. They essentially granted Spain the right to claim everything west of a meridian drawn through the Atlantic. Everything east of that line belonged to Portugal. Stop and think about that for a moment. A man in Rome, who had never set foot outside Europe, drew a line on a map and declared that everything on one side of that line, every island, every continent, every river, every mountain, every person belonged to one European kingdom. Everything on the other side belonged to another. The people living on those islands and continents were not consulted. Here's the thing about drawing lines on maps you don't understand. The line was arbitrary. It was drawn through open ocean based on compass readings that were imprecise by definition. In 1493, neither Spain nor Portugal knew what lay beyond the next few hundred miles of coastline. Neither knew about the Pacific Ocean. Neither knew about the massive continent of South America that was about to complicate their tidy arrangement enormously. Portugal, unhappy with the placement of the Pope's line, negotiated directly with Spain. The result was the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in June 1494. The new agreement moved the line further west, about 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. This adjustment seemed minor. It was anything but. By accident of geometry, by the simple act of moving a line a few hundred miles on a map, the Treaty of Tordesillas placed a chunk of a continent nobody in Europe knew existed into Portugal's half of the world. That chunk would eventually be called Brazil, the largest country in South America, with a population today of over 200 million people, speaks Portuguese instead of Spanish, because of a line drawn in a room in 1494 by men who had no idea what they were dividing. They were slicing up continents they had barely glimpsed, populated by thousands of nations, hundreds of languages, governed by political systems and spiritual traditions and agricultural practices that had been evolving for millennia. And they were doing it with the quiet confidence of men who believed truly, completely believed that the world was theirs to divide. It was the delusion made institutional, not one man's fantasy anymore. A legal framework, a treaty between kingdoms, blessed by the Pope, written on parchment, sealed with wax, filed in archives where it still sits today. And the people living on the other side of those lines, the Taíno, the Aztec, the Inca, the Guarani, the Tupinamba, the countless nations whose names European cartographers wouldn't learn for decades, went about their lives that evening, having no idea that their world had just been given away. But the line on the map was the least of it. The real collision wasn't happening in Rome, it was happening at the molecular level, because while European politicians were dividing the world on paper, something far more powerful was already crossing the ocean, something invisible, something unstoppable, something that would reshape the planet more thoroughly than any treaty or army or empire. Close your eyes for a moment, and imagine the ocean again, the same Atlantic that Columbus crossed, the same water that separates the hemispheres. Now imagine that ocean as a wall. For over 10,000 years that wall held. 2 halves of the world evolved independently. Different plants, different animals, different diseases, different immune systems. 2 biological laboratories running parallel experiments, with no contact whatsoever. In 1492, the wall came down, and what happened next was the most powerful event in the biological history of the planet since the asteroid that ended the age of the dinosaurs. It's called the Columbian Exchange, and it changed everything. Disease crossed first: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. Illnesses that Europeans had been living with for centuries that their immune systems had learned to manage, if not defeat, swept through populations that had never encountered them. Within a century of contact, some Caribbean and American populations had experienced losses of 70 to 90%. Not from warfare, not from deliberate policy, at least not initially. From invisible organisms hitchhiking on the breath and skin and clothing of people who didn't even know they were carrying them. The great health crisis of the Americas didn't announce itself. It simply spread through handshakes, through shared meals, through the ordinary human contact that the Taíno had offered so generously from the very first day on that beach in October 1492. Here's something that might surprise you. The exchange moved in both directions, and some of its most powerful effects travelled east. Food moved from the Americas to Europe, and it transformed the world. The potato, originally cultivated in the Andes, would fuel Europe's population boom over the following centuries. Reliable, calorie-dense, capable of growing in climates that defeated wheat. The potato would become the foundation of Irish, German, and Eastern European agriculture. Tomatoes, unknown in Europe before 1492, would eventually define Italian cuisine. Maize would feed populations across Africa and China. Chocolate processed from cacao beans by Mesoamerican civilizations for millennia would become a global obsession. Animals moved west. Horses, extinct in the Americas for 10,000 years, returned on Spanish ships. Within generations, they had completely rewired the cultures of the Great Plains. Cattle, pigs, sheep, goats. They followed, transforming the landscape. Sugarcane, transplanted from the Old World to Caribbean soil, would drive the establishment of plantations. That would in turn drive the forced labour trade across the Atlantic for centuries. Tonight, if you open your kitchen cupboards, you are looking at the aftershocks of 1492. That's the open loop we planted in the roadmap. And here it is, the collision between two hemispheres, still sitting on your shelf. But the Columbian Exchange wasn't just about food and disease. It was about words. And here's something that might change how you hear the English language. You've been speaking Taíno your entire life, and you didn't know it. The word hurricane, that word you hear every time a storm is named on the news, comes from Huracan, the Taíno god of storms, a deity of chaos and wind, worshipped by the very people Columbus dismissed as simple. Canoe, from the Taíno word canoa, the vessels that could carry 50 people across open ocean. Hammock, from the Taíno hammocker, the hanging beds that Columbus's sailors saw for the first time and immediately adopted, because they were, quite simply, a better way to sleep on a moving ship. Barbecue, from barbacoa, the Taíno method of slow-cooking meat over a wooden frame. Tobacco, iguana, potato, guava, papaya, savannah. The people Columbus thought were simple, the people he looked at and saw. Servants and resources gave the English language more words than most European nations ever have. Their civilization lives on, not in monuments or archives, but in the everyday vocabulary of hundreds of millions of people who have never heard the word Taíno. Every time a hurricane is named on the news, you are hearing a Taíno prayer. Every time you climb into a hammock on a summer afternoon, you are using Taíno engineering. Every time you light a barbecue in your backyard, you are practicing a Taíno tradition. The people vanished from their islands. Their words conquered the world. That is the Columbian Exchange. Not just tomatoes and smallpox and horses, a planetary remix of biology, ecology, and language. So thorough that there is not a single human being alive today whose life is not shaped by what began on that beach in October 1492. And it all started with one man's delusion, that he had found a shortcut to Asia. The Columbian Exchange was unstoppable. But what came next was a choice. Because when Columbus returned with 17 ships and 1,000 men, the age of curiosity was over. The age of systems had begun. 17 ships. That number tells you everything about what changed between the first voyage and the second. Columbus had left Spain with 3 ships and 90 men on a journey into the unknown. He returned to Hispaniola with 17 ships, over 1,200 men, horses, cattle, pigs, chickens, seeds for planting, priests for converting, and soldiers for, well, the official document said protection. But protection of what exactly? The second voyage departed Cadiz on September 25th, 1493. It was nothing like the first. The first voyage was a gamble. 3 small ships sailing into darkness on the strength of one man's miscalculation. The second voyage was an investment. Ferdinand and Isabella had seen the gold ornaments, heard the stories, watched the Taíno paraded through Barcelona, and they had made their calculations. This was no longer exploration. This was a business plan with sails. Columbus returned to Hispaniola in late November 1493, expecting to find La Navidad thriving. 39 men with nearly a year's head start on building the future. We already know what he found instead. Charred timbers, silence. None of the 39 remained. Here's what Columbus did next. He did not grieve. He did not investigate with any real patience. He sailed east along the coast and founded a new settlement, Isabella named for the queen who funded the whole enterprise. And from the very beginning, Isabella was a disaster. The site was poorly chosen, the water was bad, the soil was wrong for European crops. Hundreds of colonists fell sick within weeks. Dysentery, tropical fevers, illnesses that European medicine had no framework for treating. The men who had sailed to the New World expecting gold and glory, they found themselves digging latrines in a swamp, rationing food that was already spoiling in the Caribbean humidity. Disillusionment set in fast. These were not pioneers in any romantic sense. Many were minor nobles, second sons, fortune seekers, men who had expected to step off a ship and find wealth waiting for them, like a table set for dinner. When the gold did not materialize in the quantities Columbus had promised, the grumbling began. When the food ran short and the fevers spread, the grumbling became something closer to revolt. Columbus responded the way he always responded when reality failed to match his vision. He doubled down. He sent expeditions into the interior of Hispaniola to find the gold mines he was certain existed. He imposed a tribute system on the Taíno. Every person over the age of 14 was required to deliver a certain quantity of gold dust every 3 months. Those who met the quota received a copper token to wear around their necks. Those who did not, and most did not, because the gold Columbus imagined simply was not there in those quantities, faced consequences. Consequences that the official records describe in language designed to sound administrative rather than brutal. Here's the thing about systems. They don't need villains to cause devastation. They need paperwork. The Encomienda system evolved from Columbus's crude tribute demands into a formal legal structure over the following decades. It was perhaps the most consequential invention of the colonial era. Under the Encomienda, indigenous populations were assigned to Spanish settlers. The settlers were legally required to provide protection and religious instruction. In exchange, the indigenous people were required to provide labor. Read those 2 sentences again. Protection, religious instruction, labor. The language is the key. The system was designed to look like care while functioning as extraction. Every document, every legal framework, every official report used the vocabulary of guardianship, as if an entire civilization was being placed under the benevolent supervision of strangers who had arrived uninvited. The cruelty wasn't just in the steel, it was in the paperwork. The Taíno, who had welcomed Columbus with gifts and open arms on that October morning just a year earlier, now found themselves inside a system that converted their lives into line items on colonial ledgers. Their farming knowledge, the conocos, the cassava processing, the agricultural systems that had sustained millions was not valued, because it was not recognizable to European eyes. Their labor was valued, because it could be measured, recorded, and reported to investors back in Spain. Within a generation, the Taíno population of Hispaniola had collapsed. Scholars estimate it was somewhere between several 100,000 and several million people, not from a single catastrophe. From the accumulated weight of forced labor, disrupted food systems, European diseases against which they had no immunity, and the slow erosion of every structure that had held their world together. A system designed to look like care, functioning as extraction, producing consequences that the architects of that system would spend centuries explaining away. And Columbus, the man who started all of this, the man whose delusion had opened the door, he was already losing control of the machine he had set in motion. The settlers complained about his leadership. The crown sent investigators. The gold that was supposed to justify everything remained stubbornly insufficient. The delusion that had carried Columbus across the Atlantic was no longer just his. It belonged to the system now, and the system did not need Columbus anymore. The system didn't need Columbus anymore, but Columbus couldn't let go. And what happened to the man who had once been the most celebrated explorer in Europe is one of the most dramatic falls from grace in recorded history. The third voyage began in May 1498, and from the very start something was different. Columbus was different. He was older now, approaching 50, in an era when 50 was old. His health was failing. His eyes, strained by decades of staring at ocean horizons and reading charts by candlelight, were giving him trouble. The joints in his hands ached. The man who had once stood on the deck of the Santa Maria with the absolute certainty of a visionary, he was now standing on the deck of a smaller ship, with the desperate energy of someone who knows he is running out of chances. The Spanish crown had grown impatient. The gold that Columbus had promised, the rivers of it, the mountains of it, had not materialized. Not in anything close to the quantities his letters had described. The settlements on Hispaniola were struggling. Reports of mismanagement and chaos had been filtering back to Spain for years. Ferdinand and Isabella still supported Columbus, but the warmth of Barcelona was a distant memory. Here's what really gets me about Columbus's third voyage. He actually found something extraordinary and he couldn't see it. In August 1498, Columbus reached the coast of South America. He sailed along what is now Venezuela, encountered the vast freshwater outflow of the Orinoco River, a river so enormous that its current pushed fresh water miles out into the Caribbean, and he recorded in his journal that a river this large could not come from an island. It had to come from a continent. He was right. He was standing off the coast of a landmass that would reshape European understanding of the world. And then, in his very next journal entry, he concluded that this continent must be the location of the Garden of Eden. Not Asia, not a new world, the literal Garden of Eden from the book of Genesis. The delusion had evolved. It was no longer just a geographic error. It had become something theological, something that existed beyond the reach of evidence or reason. Columbus was no longer simply wrong about where he was. He was constructing an entire cosmology to protect himself from the truth. Meanwhile, back on Hispaniola, the colony was falling apart. Columbus's brothers Bartholomew and Diego, whom he had left in charge, had managed to alienate nearly everyone. Spanish colonists had rebelled. The Taíno population was in catastrophic decline, and the reports reaching Spain painted a picture of an administration that was incompetent at best and tyrannical at worst. In 1500, the crown sent Francisco de Bobadilla to investigate. Bobadilla arrived in Hispaniola, assessed the situation, and made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. He arrested Columbus, the admiral of the ocean sea, the man who had been paraded through Barcelona as the greatest explorer of his age, placed in chains and loaded onto a ship bound for Spain. The image is almost impossible to reconcile with the triumphant return of 1493. The same man, the same ocean, but this time he crossed it in irons. The explorer had become a prisoner. Columbus was eventually released. Ferdinand and Isabella still had enough residual loyalty to free him and restore some of his dignities, but the damage was done. His governorship of Hispaniola was permanently revoked. His reputation was in ruins. The man who had once commanded the attention of the most powerful court in Europe now struggled to get an audience. But here's where the irony becomes almost unbearable. Columbus could not stop. In 1502, at the age of 51, with failing health and a shattered reputation, Columbus persuaded the crown to fund a fourth voyage. One more chance. One more attempt to find the passage to Asia that he was certain existed. That he had always been certain existed. That he would be certain existed until the very end. The fourth voyage was a catastrophe from the beginning. Storms, hostile encounters along the Central American coast. Ships riddled with shipworms. the hulls so compromised that the vessels were literally disintegrating beneath the crew's feet. By June 1503, Columbus was forced to beach his remaining ships on the coast of Jamaica. He was stranded there for over a year. A year. On a beach in Jamaica, with a shrinking crew, failing supplies, and no rescue in sight. The man who had once commanded 17 ships now commanded a pair of rotting hulls sinking into Caribbean sand. During that year, Columbus wrote a letter, the Lettera Rarissima, the most rare letter, addressed to Ferdinand and Isabella. It is one of the most extraordinary documents of the age of exploration, not because of what it reveals about the world, but because of what it reveals about the mind that wrote it. The letter is desperate, rambling, brilliant, and delusional in roughly equal measure. Columbus describes his discoveries, his sufferings, his betrayals. He quotes scripture. He weeps on the page, "I wept and said, O blessed Mother of God, defend me." He insists still that he is near Asia. He claims God speaks to him directly. He compares himself to David, to Moses, to figures whose suffering was a sign of divine favour. It is the letter of a man who has built his entire identity around a vision that the world has already disproven, and who cannot, will not let it go. Because letting it go would mean admitting that the thing that defined his life was a mistake, and some people would rather be wrong forever than face that kind of emptiness. Columbus was eventually rescued from Jamaica in June 1504. He returned to Spain, broken, sick, and largely ignored by the court that had once celebrated him. The man who had once been paraded through Barcelona now could not get an appointment. 2 years later, in a quiet room in a Spanish city that most people today couldn't find on a map, the story of Christopher Columbus came to its end. And the way it ended tells you everything about the delusion that divided the world. May 20th, 1506. Valladolid, Spain. It's a city you've probably never thought about. A modest Castilian town, far from the gleaming ports of Seville or the grandeur of Barcelona. Not the kind of place where you'd expect the story of the man who changed the world to end. But that's where it ended. Columbus was 54 years old. His body was failing, ravaged by years of ocean voyages, tropical diseases, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting the world to accept your version of reality. He suffered from what modern physicians believe was reactive arthritis, his joints swollen, his movements slow and painful. His eyes, those eyes that had scanned more ocean horizon than almost any European alive, were clouding. He had been stripped of most of his titles. The governorship of the lands he had claimed was gone. The vast wealth he had been promised. The 10% of all revenues from the New World. The guarantee written into his original contract with the Crown. Reduced to legal arguments. Arguments that his heirs would fight over for decades. The court that had once paraded him through the streets barely acknowledged his existence. A few friends gathered around his bed. His sons Diego and Ferdinand were there, a handful of loyal associates, no representatives from the Crown, no fanfare, no ceremony befitting the man who had redirected the course of human civilization, whether anyone fully understood it yet. Here's the thing about Columbus's death. It wasn't tragic because he failed. It was tragic because he succeeded at something he never understood. He died, still believing he had reached Asia. Say that again, slowly, because this is the center of everything we've been talking about for the last 2 hours. Christopher Columbus, the man who crossed the Atlantic, who made first contact between two hemispheres separated for over 10,000 years, who set in motion the Columbian exchange, the Encomienda system, the Treaty of Tordesillas, the complete demographic and ecological transformation of the planet. He died in a modest room in Valladolid, surrounded by a handful of people, insisting with his final breath that the islands he had visited were off the coast of China. He never knew about North America. He never knew about South America. Not really, not as a continent, not as a world unto itself. He never knew that the ocean he crossed was not the western edge of the known world, but the eastern edge of an unknown one. He never knew that the thing he actually did was infinitely larger and more consequential than the thing he thought he was doing. He couldn't see what he'd found because he couldn't let go of what he'd imagined. Sometimes the biggest discoveries are invisible to the person who makes them. Sometimes a man can sail across an ocean touch the shore of a hemisphere, set in motion events that will reshape every continent, every language, every kitchen cupboard on Earth, and never once understand what he has done, because understanding would require letting go of the story, and the story was all he had. The delusion that divided the world began with one man's certainty that he knew where he was going. It ended with that same man's certainty that he had arrived. Both were wrong, and the distance between those two errors contains the entire modern world. The room in Valladolid has been quiet for 500 years now, but the aftershocks of what began in that room and on that ocean are still travelling through your world tonight. The Atlantic is still out there tonight. The same ocean, the same darkness, the same vast, patient expanse of water, crossing itself in slow currents since long before any human being stood on a shore and wondered what was on the other side. The waves that carried Columbus west are still rolling. The trade winds that filled his sails are still blowing. The stars that he used to navigate imperfectly, hopefully, stubbornly, are still turning overhead. But everything else has changed. 1492 is in your vocabulary tonight. You say hurricane. Without knowing, you're invoking a Taíno god of storms. You say canoe. Without knowing, you're describing a vessel that could carry 50 people across open Caribbean water. You lie in a hammock on a summer afternoon. Without knowing that the word itself, hammocker, was a gift, from people who understood comfort in ways that European sailors had never imagined. 1492 is in your kitchen. The potatoes that fueled empires, the tomatoes that invented Italian cuisine, the chocolate that became a global language of comfort, the chili peppers that transformed cooking on every continent, all of it, every bite, every flavour, every recipe you've ever loved traces back to a collision between two halves of the world that had been evolving separately for over 10,000 years. 1492 is in the demographics of every continent, in the languages spoken across the Americas, in the genetic heritage of billions of people, in the political borders that were drawn by men in rooms who had never seen the lands they were dividing, in the trade routes and economic systems, the cultural exchanges that flow, still, along the paths that were carved open, when that wall between hemispheres finally came down. 1492 is in the air you're breathing as you drift towards sleep. And you're not alone in thinking about it tonight. Wherever you are right now, and I know you're scattered across time zones, across hemispheres, across the very geography that Columbus rearranged, someone else is listening to these same words. Someone in a different city, a different season, a different life. Unable to sleep for their own reasons, thinking about the same man in the same room in Valladolid, wondering the same thing you're wondering. How does one person's certainty reshape the entire world? Maybe the answer is that it doesn't take certainty that's right, just certainty that's absolute. And maybe the real lesson of 1492 isn't about Columbus at all. Maybe it's about the distance between what we believe and what is actually true, and how that distance, that gap between conviction and reality is where history happens, where it has always happened. The ocean is still out there, still patient, still vast, still carrying the echoes of wooden hulls and whispered prayers and the word land shouted into darkness. Let it carry you now, wherever you need to go tonight, whatever you need to let go of, whatever certainties you're holding that might not survive the morning. That's okay. The ocean doesn't judge. It just moves, steadily, patiently, the way it has moved since long before any of us were here, and will move long after. Rest well. Good night.